Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today's professional is Laura LeBlanc, who is an upper school science faculty member at the Bush School in Seattle, Washington, where she teaches chemistry, environmental science, and regional geology of the Pacific Northwest. Today, she'll be speaking about her experience as a scientist and an educator, as well as her experience about working in male-dominated workplaces or disciplines. And Laura will be able to answer any questions at the end of her presentation. So you can begin whenever you're ready.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So like Julia said, I'll talk a little about my experience in science education. And I thought that maybe it'd be useful to kind of allow you to see my pathway and kind of how I got into science from an early age moving forward. Let me just make sure this is advancing. Oh, there we go. Great. So when I was, quite young, I got to spend a lot of time in the outdoors from a young age until now. And I think that experience in the outdoors and just getting to see a lot of different phenomenons and processes and just kind of the wonders of nature really got me excited about science. I was always very curious. And if you ask my mom about when I was 4, I definitely asked a lot of questions, lots of whys and hows. And I still ask a lot of whys and hows. And I think for me, that was why science was so great, is because it allowed me to at least answer some of those hows and whys. I also had a few really great teachers that helped me to stay excited about science, both in high school and then also in college. For my parental support and encouragement, I wouldn't say that my parents said, "Oh, you should go into science or you have to do this," but more that they were like, "Follow your passion. Whatever you think is interesting and exciting, do that." They weren't like, "This is the kind of job you should have," or "This is who you should be." It's just like, if that makes you happy and you're excited about it, then go do it. So I feel like there was always kind of lots of open doors or possible doorways that I could go through. And then I had great peers, I would say, especially when I was in college studying physics, which was not always easy, oftentimes hard. I was really lucky early on in my first couple of years in college. I kind of fell in with a really great group of women that were all studying physics. And I think it's in part thanks to them for sure that I persevered through physics. But it was, great to have them as peers and support and people to bounce ideas off of and solve problems with. I also had, when I was in grad school, I take it back. When I was in undergrad, there was some graduate students that I was taking classes with. So it's possible to sometimes in like upper division classes, you can take a class that's offered jointly in the graduate school and as the undergrad program. And so I took a few of those, and there was some really awesome graduate students in a few of those classes that kind of brought me under their wing. And when we were going through tough problems and stuff, would help me in solving those problems, or like if there was places where maybe there was things I hadn't learned about yet that they had learned about, they were just really great in being super supportive and kind of treating me as an equal, though, like not so much like a younger person that had to be taught, but more someone to kind of bounce ideas off of. And then I've also had some great role models along the way of both men and women in STEM doing things that I was excited about, and watching them have cool experiences. So I think, to me, all of those things kind of brought me into the field of science and have continued to support me doing work in science. When I went into college, and I guess part of my kind of describing my path is maybe to give, I don't know if I'd say insights to you, but kind of things to think about as you're thinking about where you want to go, maybe in schooling or in your career. So when I first went to college, I was interested in science in general, and I thought physics was really cool. And that was kind of my plan, was to get a degree in physics. And so I was in the physics program for a couple of years, and there was one term where it was time to sign up for some electives, and I was kind of browsing through the course catalog. And I happened to pop over to some of the geology and geophysics classes because I thought, well, those sound interesting too. And I knew they were outside of my department, but there was a couple that caught my eye. And so 2 different classes I took in different terms really they related a lot more to my interests. And I found them in some ways much more exciting and engaging than maybe some of the physics classes that I was taking. And I was really lucky that at the time, the physics advisor at the UW where I was at helped me understand that I could actually take geophysics electives to count for physics requirements, so kind of do almost like a dual major, which I ended up doing. And so I guess kind of this takeaway to me is like, hey, if you go to college, like don't stick just to classes inside your department or degree, but maybe try out some other ones that you find interesting, and you never know where that might take you. So for me, like I could have ended up getting a degree in physics, but instead I ended up getting a degree in physics and then also in geophysics. And that's really where I went with graduate school. And I found, yeah, for the most part, the geology and the geophysics courses inspired me more, maybe kind of held my attention more. I found really great peers in those programs that not only were fun to hang out with in class, but also to do things outside of class with. That picture here is myself and a few other folks at the geology field camp. That's a requirement for geology undergrads at the UW. And that was just an amazing experience to get out and really, I guess for me, experience field science for the first time, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But kind of understanding how messy field science is, but also how exciting it can be in terms of like, you never know exactly what you're going to find or kind of how you're going to put all the pieces together. So after college, I took a little time off, and then I started pursuing graduate school. And when I was looking into graduate school, I knew that by that point, kind of based on some of the electives I'd taken as an undergrad, that I was really interested in studying glaciology or snow science. And this in part was because of my interest and excitement in just spending time in the mountains. And so to me, it was kind of like the science that related most to the things that I found interesting anyway, and that kind of catered most to like my recreational interests as well. So I knew I wanted to pursue those two. And so I looked at a couple of different grad schools. One of them was the University of Fairbanks, or University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And I think one thing that helped me make the decision was knowing that I had some options. So I knew that I could choose to go there, but there are a couple other options as well. And when I was thinking about Fairbanks, there was definitely some fears. Like for any of you that know anything about interior Alaska, it's very cold and very dark in the wintertime. Fairbanks is a pretty small town. Like it's not the amazing metropolis that Seattle is. And I loved being in the mountains. And as you can see from this picture, like there are some amazing mountains in Alaska, but these are about a 3-hour drive from Fairbanks. And unlike the mountains that we're used to around here, where there's like a major highway that goes through the mountains, these mountains, you can drive kind of near them, but it's going to take you hours to actually get into them, or sometimes you even have to fly into them. So for me, like being in and around the mountains was really important. And I thought, in Alaska, those mountains are kind of far away and remote. Like, how much time am I going to get to spend in them? So these are kind of some of my fears. But I thought to myself, I'm just going to give it a chance. Like, if I don't like it, I can come back to Seattle, and I know that I've got other options. So actually, I'm really grateful to a professor/advisor at another school that I was looking at that was great in talking to me about my decisions and said, hey, if Fairbanks doesn't work out, like if that's your first choice, we're happy to have you next year. Like you have that as an out. So that was really nice to have those options that allowed me to kind of step into this challenge a little bit more. And in the end, what I found is that moving to Alaska was like the best thing I ever could have done. Like when I think about my 3 or 4 years in Alaska, it's some of my most cherished experiences that I've had probably in most of my life. So I guess for me to you is kind of another takeaway and kind of thinking about pathways and options is sometimes lean into those ones of uncertainty, or maybe where you're not sure exactly if that's what you want to do, but there's some things that are appealing about it, and just give it a try. And you might be very pleasantly surprised. Like for me, what I found is that I got to spend a lot of time in the mountains. The experiences looked different, or maybe it took more time, but the mountains were like that much more amazing. So it's kind of worth the extra effort. I also got to experience living in a little tiny cabin all by myself, which was great. Kind of outside of Fairbanks. It was a really cool setting. I had a great landlord. There was no running water, so that was exciting, learning how to just manage water in the cabin and work with an outhouse during the wintertime. But all these things were like experiences that I wouldn't have had anyplace else. And I'm very grateful for those. So yeah, definitely lean into those kind of unknown opportunities. So while I was in grad school, I got to do some field science. That was part of my main research. And actually, I'm going to see if, and so when I was doing my research, it was on the Bering Glacier in Alaska, which I thought I had. Okay, the slides just somehow got switched. So I'll go back to that slide in a minute. So I did my graduate research on the Bering Glacier in Southcentral Alaska. And as you can see from that picture, it's kind of on the sort of like the armpit of Alaska up there. And my research was on looking at how motion and icequakes might relate. So we collected a bunch of seismic data and a bunch of GPS motion data to see what is this relationship on glaciers, with kind of the hope that it might provide us some insight into possible ice dynamics that are challenging to measure. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. This gives you kind of another picture of that glacier. So where that upper GPS station is, you can kind of think of that as like, that's the beginning of the Bering Glacier. The upper part of it is also the Bagley ice field. And then that whole glacier that kind of looks like a river of ice that flows down to that little lake is about 125 miles long. So huge glacier. And we had these aspirations for like the field data that we're going to collect. So to go out and do this data collection, we had to either go there by helicopter in the summertime when you couldn't land with a plane, but in the winter, in Alaska and maybe in other places, they outfit planes basically with skis under their wheels. And so if they're landing on dry land, they can pick up the skis and land on wheels. But if they're landing on snow, they can actually put down the skis almost kind of like float planes, but they're skis instead of floats. And it allows these somewhat large, small planes to land on snow and glaciers. And to me, this was kind of my second field experience. So that first one was doing the field school, the geology field school in the summer. And what I learned from both of those experiences is that, kind of like my experience of moving to Alaska, that your data can often be surprising, not always what you're hoping for, but often maybe gives you insight that you didn't expect, but leads you in really new, cool directions. And part of the reason I put this in was because I think often maybe at least when some people think about science, we kind of think about like the lab-based science or maybe computer-based science. And for those of you that are maybe less aware, just want to kind of make you aware of there's so many different pathways that you can follow through science. You can do lab-based or you can do computer-based, but there's also a lot of great field science out there. And if you're someone that enjoys being outside, there's so many different fields: geology, biology, ecology, environmental science. Even in physics, there's probably some field options. So kind of thinking about what makes you tick, what would you enjoy doing, and then kind of following that passion. So there were some times where we would just go onto the glacier for a day when we were going out with helicopters. And then other times, like in that bottom right picture, we actually camped out there for about a week to kind of set up our field sites initially. And maybe before I talk a little bit more kind of about my pathway and experiences, since I brought up my research, a lot of you might be saying, what on earth is an icequake? Like, hopefully most of you, especially in the Seattle area, have heard of earthquakes, but an icequake, this seemed like a weird thing. So an icequake, similar to an earthquake, it's a seismic event. So basically like a shaking of material or the ground. But this seismic event originates within a glacier or an ice sheet. Ice sheets and ice streams are just really big glaciers. Sometimes also on frozen lakes, like the ice on the lakes as it's kind of shifting and moving can make really tiny, small seismic events, or if we have other kind of large bodies of ice. And when we're looking at these, the way that we know, like if we're looking at the information from a seismometer, that it's an icequake and not just an earthquake that the seismometer is picking up, is these icequakes tend to have different waveforms, meaning like they're like if you had a picture of the output from the seismometer, the shape of the wave looks different than it would look for an earthquake. And the frequency also tends to be a little bit different to kind of like how closely packed the peaks of that waveform are. And if we can locate it, it would show up as locating on the glacier as opposed to maybe on a fault line or something or in crustal rock. When we locate them, they're always shallow depth. So they're always happening right on the surface, which is not typical of earthquakes. And they're small enough that these ice-based seismometers will pick them up. But seismometers that are like on bedrock, that are more meant for picking up earthquakes and like regional events, we don't see them showing up on those seismometers. So that tells us, it's kind of like double confirmation. Oh, they're coming from the ice. They're pretty small compared to an earthquake. But what's exciting about them is the general idea of what causes them is ice moving in some way or other, or maybe kind of ice fracturing. And glaciers are always flowing, so they're like big giant rivers of ice. But what's cool about these ice quakes, potentially, is that the different types of ice quakes that we see can tell us about stuff that maybe is happening like at the bottom of the glacier, where the glacier is sitting on the bedrock, things that we can't see and can't measure very well, but it can tell us more about the processes that are happening there. So it's some pretty exciting research. And yeah, in terms of like what these ice quakes are coming from, so like in the picture here, you can see a bunch of cracks in the ice. Those are called crevasses. So when crevasses kind of open or shift, that might make a little ice quake. Calving is just when you have a glacier that goes into the ocean or goes into a lake, and there's like icebergs that fall off the end of the glacier. Some of you might have seen that in movies or pictures. That's what it's called, calving. When the icebergs are kind of breaking, or the ice is breaking off of the front of the glacier. Icefall, like basically if there's like a steep part of the glacier, maybe the ice is a little bit more broken up. Sometimes when those chunks of ice break off and fall, they cause this. The stick slip basal motion, so that's what I was talking about a little bit, that we often can't tell exactly what's happening at the base, but these ice quakes or these little seismic events might be able to tell us a little bit more of like when the glacier slips a little bit, maybe we see an event or something. So we can kind of see not just the fact that they're happening, but when they're happening. The glacier bed recoupling is getting into a little bit of glaciology, but the idea of like if the glacier was kind of sliding on its bed and then it stops sliding, so kind of like either refreezes or kind of recouples that bed. Some events might show that. Hydraulic transients, the simple version of that is if you've ever been in an old house or an old building and you turn on a faucet and there's kind of like this hammer sound as like the water kind of moves up, it's because there's maybe some air bubbles or basically like some kind of pressure dynamics that are happening in those pipes. So the same thing can happen in a glacier as water is moving through the glacier. We might see some like weird shifts in kind of that drainage system. And then other kind of cracks that I won't really talk about. But so there's a lot of things that the ice quakes could be coming from. And what we were hoping to see is if we measured the glacier moving, and if we measure these seismic events, we might see, oh, when the glacier moves in certain ways, we see particular events. And that could tell us like directly about the processes. That was our goal. We didn't actually see that. But what we did see instead of something totally unexpected was we saw like there was a big rain event that made the glacier flow a lot faster for a little while because there was a lot of water kind of moving through and at the bed. And we saw that the types of ice quakes that showed up during that time were very different than other times. So while it didn't tell us exactly what the processes were, it told us that there was like a big shift in what was going on with the glacier. Or we also saw like seasonal changes. And another thing that we saw that was really exciting was in the wintertime, kind of assume that glaciers kind of go to sleep. Like they're moving a little bit, but they're not nearly as active as in the summer when there's a lot of water and things are melting. But in the wintertime, we saw these other ice quakes showing up that told us, there's something going on with the glacier in the wintertime. It's not actually asleep. It's just behaving a little bit differently. So it's kind of cool. Like this field data, sort of almost like my experience of moving to Alaska. I didn't get what I expected, but instead I got to learn a bunch of other things that were maybe even more interesting or insightful. So kind of takeaway that it's like field science is cool. If you can do field science, I highly recommend it. Sometimes it's a little bit time consuming, might take your like longer to get through a program, but it's fantastic. So that was kind of like me moving through science as a student. And then along that pathway and kind of before, between, and after, I had these various opportunities that I decided to take advantage of that allowed me to keep practicing science and exploring the world of science, but also allowed me to experience what it was like to teach other people science. So this picture is a bunch of kids from a little tiny town of Alakakit that you can only get to by plane or by boat. Or if it's in the wintertime, you can also get there by snow machine, but there's no roads that go all the way to Alakakit. And an organization that I was working for called Tanana Chiefs Conference. So this was like another maybe a risk/opportunity that I jumped into a couple summers during grad school. I was looking for some work and a friend of mine knew about this position. I was interested in fisheries, but I didn't have a whole lot of background in fisheries, but I had some background in doing some teaching, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. And So what they were looking for in the fisheries division was really like an education outreach person to work within the fisheries division. And so that was my role. And through that role, I got to put together this whole science camp. So I was responsible for figuring out all the logistics, like how do we get the gear there? How do we get the kids there? What are we doing for food? Like how are we managing all that? And I got to plan the curriculum, at least the Western science side of it. So what was really cool, and this was not necessarily like a model that I created, it was a version of this camp had kind of existed before my position. But the camp was a merger of Western science and traditional knowledge. And so there was myself, there was like a fisheries biologist, there was a wildlife ecologist, there was some people that came in from kind of the nearby wildlife refuge that did some education. So there was a bunch of kind of scientists and field workers. But then we also hired some elders from the village to teach more about their traditional knowledge. And the idea was that like all of these things are relevant and important to kind of understand the world around you. So what was really cool for me is I got to learn a lot of things that I would have never learned otherwise, like the different parts of a beaver and like what you might eat or what you might not eat and why, or like how to properly cut salmon so you can hang them to dry without having to have like any sort of real infrastructure, but they dry perfectly and you can store them for months and months and have really yummy kind of salmon jerky for a long time after that. So it was a really neat experience for me, for sure. And probably the biggest part of that experience was just recognizing how much I enjoyed teaching people my knowledge of science and also learning from them and learning from other educators and just kind of seeing like different styles of teaching. So kind of in addition to that, both before that experience and after that experience, for a long time, I've been a ski instructor. And so for me, that's kind of a fun challenge is like, how do you teach someone about like how their body moves on skis and how they can do that maybe better or more efficiently or like have a better time doing that? And so definitely kind of an out of classroom teaching experience, but also gave me experience in terms of like how people learn and maybe what different people are desiring from their educational experience. And then the snow science. So I mentioned a while ago that the two things that I wanted to study in grad school were glaciology and snow science. And in the end, I ended up being in more of a glaciology program, that it was going to be too hard to juggle both that and snow science. So during grad school, I didn't get to do a lot of snow science, except that during grad school, I met some great friends who lived down in Valdez who were starting to do some avalanche courses. And also needed someone to go out in the field sometimes and collect some snow data. And so that's kind of where I first started off in doing that and learned a lot from those folks, and then carried that forward, eventually got a certification to teach and lead avalanche courses. And so in that way, it's another fun way for me to be in a place that I love, but also get to share kind of science and then maybe risk assessment and decision making with both youth. So I teach like teenage avalanche courses and then also adult avalanche courses. And I think for me, like the outdoor teaching part of it was fun in learning, like how do you teach or convey information in maybe a pretty efficient way and also a relatable way? Because when you're out in the snow and the cold, people maybe don't have as much patience sometimes. And so you want to make sure that you're conveying information in a way that they can absorb it, even when they might be a little bit cold and hungry, and also in a way that they can use it later. So like what's most relevant to them. So I was going through this path, right, of in grad school, studying science, getting my master's in science, and also getting these various teaching experiences along the way. And so at the end of grad school, kind of came to the point of, well, what do I want to be? Do I want to be a scientist or do I want to be a teacher? And I guess acknowledging, of course, like in being a teacher, it's not that I'm not being a scientist, but more like, did I want to be a scientist in industry or like in academics? And I knew that I really loved science. And I love certain aspects of being a scientist, but there were also certain aspects that I didn't really love as much. Like the idea of if I was in academia, I was always going to have to be applying for like grant funding, and often writing a lot of research papers. And to be honest, I love science. I love collecting data. I love kind of figuring out the explanations of things. I don't necessarily love writing research papers. And so I realized, maybe like being a scientist in academia or even in industry maybe isn't exactly what I wanted to. And through all these other experiences, I also learned, wow, like I really enjoy teaching people and being with people and being part of their learning experience, maybe just as much as I loved science. And so rather than thinking about like, oh, what career field would be like most practical or most logical to follow, again, I followed my passions, and decided to follow the career that I was going to feel most engaged in, most fulfilled in. And I would say that looking back on that, I would never make a different decision. Definitely happy with where I ended up and continuing to learn on that path. And so now for me as a teacher of STEM, and also still, I would say a student of STEM, like maybe some of you are aware of this, but whenever you teach something, you learn way more about that thing than maybe you would have if you didn't teach it. And so I would say every day, maybe it's because of student questions or kind of from my own questions, like, how well can I explain this? I'm always learning more about science as a teacher. And so what I love about science is learning kind of the underlying processes that cause and explain what we see and experience in the world around us. So kind of like on a little tiny scale, what's happening that explains what we see or what we touch or what we feel or what we experience. And I know that for some people, like learning those things might kind of take away the magic of the nature, but for me, it really only like increases my wonder and awe of like, wow, that is incredible. So an example of that, these pictures on the side, you might have gathered that snow is one of my favorite things, and it is. So snowflakes, if you've ever cut out a snowflake or maybe looked really closely at a snowflake, snowflakes always have 6 sides, or like 6 points to them. And the reason for that, if we go down to like the molecular scale, the way that water molecules come together when they're a solid, so kind of the way they're attracted to each other and sort of the structure that takes on, creates this little crystal lattice with these hexagonal shapes. So in the tiny, tiny, tiny scale that we can't even really fathom, because like in one snowflake, there's billions and billions and billions and billions of water molecules in one tiny little snowflake. But on that very tiny scale is that same 6-sided structure that just repeats again and again and again and creates the snowflake that we see. So I always think that's pretty cool. And so my favorite part of teaching really is kind of bringing students into this same wonder and awe, or at least trying to, and helping students to understand these underlying processes, either in the way that I do or in ways that make sense to them, so that they also get kind of a better, a deeper understanding of the world around them. And I would say my desire as a science teacher is as much as I can to make science approachable and engaging and relevant for all students, kind of regardless of interests. And part of that motivation comes from the idea that like the STEM community definitely needs more diversity, like more different students from different racial backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, different backgrounds of interest, because many, many studies have shown that the more diverse our science community is, the better science that we do. So that's part of my motivation. And just like I get excited when I see anybody that decides that they want to go into science. And so the more people that I can support and encourage along that pathway definitely fulfills and makes me happy. So I've talked for a while. I'm curious. Julia, you said there might be some questions, or maybe people have questions now.
Yeah, so we do have a couple questions. Thank you so much for this presentation.
You're welcome.
Okay, so the first question is, why did you pick studying ice glaciers over things such as volcanoes or other geological things?
That is a great question. Actually, I forgot to mention on the very first slide of the presentation. Actually, maybe I'll just go back to that really quick, because I feel like if you asked me now to decide what I might study, volcanoes actually might be just as high on my list as glaciers. So this is a picture of a couple different volcanoes in Chile. And the folks that are skiing, I'm not one of those, but they were some friends that I was skiing with. And we're actually standing on the flank of another volcano. And actually, my interest in science allowed me to go to Chile. So as an avalanche educator, I needed to take one more course for certification, and the course that worked best for my timing happened to be in Chile. I took that course a few years before this picture was taken, and that allowed me to build connections to continue to go there and be in a place where there's really cool geology, actually kind of similar to the Northwest. And so, now if you ask me, like, do I want to study glaciers or do I want to study volcanoes? Ooh, that would be tricky because they're both like really interesting and dynamic. and definitely relate a lot to things. But I think for me, I don't know, there was just something about snow and ice. Like I can't even tell you exactly what it is really, because like I would say like at age 5, I already thought snow was really cool. Who knows why? Like we don't even get that much snow in Seattle.
Wow.
But yeah, it's always
Wow,
just
that's really interesting.
yeah.
All right. Okay. The next question is, how important would you say STEM is for younger students?
And by younger, like I'm guessing we're thinking like elementary
Elementary
school, middle
school?
school. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's hugely important because I feel like that, like I said, like the reason that I got into STEM or was interested in science was because of kind of that young curiosity. And I think, people can have curiosity at any age, but especially like at that, between like age 5 and age 10, like you're just curious. And I think that at that age, you're not old enough yet to think about like, oh, is this a good question? Or like, is this an answerable question? You're just asking a lot of questions. And so I think it's a great time for kids to get to experience science, technology, and math in different ways because they're really open to kind of learning and seeing and maybe engaging with it in some ways even more than older students. Of course, like you want to make it at a level that's approachable to them. But yeah, I think having good science education in elementary school is really important.
Yeah, and especially since like almost everything in the world now has to do with STEM, you should learn about it in school and have enough knowledge, right?
Definitely, like a lot
Yeah,
of the current things around us now, like climate change, COVID, etc. Like
exactly. Yeah.
being able to understand all of those things, if you have even just like some basic foundation in science, I think you can understand what's going on a lot better than if you didn't.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, next question is, did you experience anything new when creating your own curriculum?
Hmm.
Like any hardships or like,
Oh,
you
well, I
know?
have to say, yeah, definitely. I mean, building your own curriculum is always hard. I do have to say, like, I have to give acknowledgement to all the other amazing teachers out there on the planet because thank goodness for the internet, there's a lot of different resources. And so, like, in creating curriculum, just like how science is really collaborative, I'm definitely, pulling from different sources and looking at, like, what are different people doing and what are some great ideas out there that I can use to kind of build a curriculum that makes sense. But it's definitely challenging and time consuming. And I would say that I think every year I've probably changed my curriculum a little bit because I'll try out one thing and there's some things I like and some things where I'm like, ugh, I thought that was a great idea and the students hated it. Or like, ugh, they like, maybe they didn't tell me they hated it, but I'm like, oh, I thought this was going to be amazing. And they didn't like, I'm pretty sure they didn't learn from that. I need to do something different. So I think the challenge with creating your own curriculum is that you're you're kind of always wanting to make it better, which means you're always working to change it. But that
Yeah,
part
that's
also,
the interesting part, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
It's just like trying new things every time. Okay, and I think the last question is, do you have any tips for those who are working towards teaching STEM to their community and other students?
Well, for me, kind of a big rule of thumb is like how simply could I explain something really complicated? And so it's not to say like you should dumb things down, but like how kind of palatable or tangible can you make certain concepts to make it maybe more accessible to more people? Um, there's I want to say, I think it's an Einstein quote that says something about like, if you can't explain it simply, you simply don't understand it well enough. So, not to say that everyone needs to be an expert in science to be able to teach science, but I think, yeah, like not making science overly complicated. Like it's a lot of it is simple enough that, like it should empower people to understand the world around them as opposed to like feeling frustrating and too challenging.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It really gave insight on like how important STEM education is and like what kinds of passions and ideals you can pursue in it. Because I've never really met someone who studied ice glaciers, and it was really interesting like hearing about everything that goes into it. And it just like shows how many different things you can do in STEM, right? Because nowadays mostly you just hear about computer science, engineering in STEM, and it's very eye-opening to see things like chemistry and geophysics being thrown in there. It's great.
Yeah, and I
Um,
would say, like, there's
yeah.
maybe one thing to add, like, I wouldn't wanna downplay I mean, for me, field science is what really made me tick But like if someone's interested in computer science or maybe more like lab-based science or like computer-generated engineering, I mean, all of those things are very important as well, and we need people that love those. So if that's your passion, follow that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I do see another question here someone just asked. Which life lessons did you take away with your experiences with ice glaciers and these areas of STEM?
Well, maybe expect the unexpected. And I guess there's so many cool processes out there, so just kind of keep digging and keep being observant.
Yeah.
Also, like, I feel like, I mean, part of this I actually learned from some of my travel in Chile, but some of it I learned from doing some field-based research is make a plan, like go in with a plan, and this probably applies to a lot of things. Go in with a plan, but don't plan so much that you're rigidly stuck to that plan. In other words, like be open to your plan completely changing, because you might find yourself walking down pathways that you didn't plan on, but that were actually great outcomes.
Yeah, that's a really good message to people who might be struggling on different kinds of things. Yeah. All right. I think that's it. So thank you so much for this presentation. I really loved it. I learned a lot. And if you have nothing else to add, I think we could end this talk here.
Great.
All right.
Well, have a great weekend, Julia.
All right. Have a great weekend, everyone. And Laura, thank you so much once again.
You're welcome.